Once again, the Royal Air Force had to be reborn after a world war. For a technical revolution had begun while we were in conflict with the ingenious Germans. Many good men had gone, and our first jet aircraft were already aging, although a Meteor had captured the official world speed record, and our Vampires were the first jets to fly the Atlantic. For the first time, an air member for technical services joined the Air Council to help reshape the R.A.F. A new generation of men had to be trained, and a new generation of aircraft built. Wartime research had already shaped the future pattern of air power. Multi-jet bombers, swept-wing fighters, and airborne guided missiles. Britain had designed an aircraft to fly faster than sound, but the government decided
the impression that supersonic aircraft are just around the corner is quite erroneous.
Our project was cancelled. Yet the Americans and Russians were very soon flying at supersonic speeds. In 1948, the Russians, our wartime allies, tried to force the Western powers to abandon Berlin by cutting off all land links with the city. The Western powers replied with the biggest ever airlift into the city's airfields. Reminded one of a wartime bomber stream without the flak. British and American aircraft over Berlin again, round the clock. Coordinating air traffic and cargo handling was a non-stop nightmare. We even had Sunderlands coming in with salt and coal. Then they flew out with loads of kids. At peak, we lifted 335,000 tons in a month. Fantastic. The Berliners called it Luftbrücke, air bridge. It kept them alive all winter until the Kremlin lifted the siege. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth forces got into a shooting war with the communists out in Malaya. The enemy was pretty hard to find in the jungle, which was often impassable. The soldiers and police relied heavily on airdrops to supply their food and ammo. We used a lot of light aircraft that could operate from small clearings. Our task was to maintain contact with distant jungle forts and villages, often threatened by terrorists. The first R.A.F. helicopters proved their value in this grueling war. No less than 36 types of aircraft had to be maintained in a really hostile climate. No great battles were fought, but a number of R.A.F. lives were lost, for it took 50 million miles in the air and 12 years to help prevent the communists taking over Malaya, as they later did elsewhere in Southeast Asia. In this climate of Cold War, the United States of America and Canada formed a military alliance with Western Europe. Belgium, Denmark, France, West Germany, Greece, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Holland, Norway, Portugal, Turkey, and the United Kingdom all became members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Confronting them were Russia and her satellites, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, which formed the Warsaw Pact alliance. From now on, Britain's armed forces were committed to defend NATO. When the young Queen reviewed her Air Force in 1953, it was larger than ever before in peacetime and equipped to perform its tasks anywhere in a troubled world. But most of the 400 jet aircraft which flew past were soon to be replaced by a new generation. The Hunter, the first British swept-wing fighter. The Provost, which introduced jet training in the R.A.F. The Javelin, our first all-weather fighter. The record-breaking Canberra was our first jet bomber. Then came the four-engine Valiants, one of which flew non-stop to South Africa, advancing the art of air refueling, which would greatly extend the range of the Air Force. Finally came the futuristic Vulcan and the crescent-winged Victor. These V-bombers, planned soon after the war, were designed to carry British atomic weapons as a powerful deterrent to any aggressor. The British hydrogen bomb was successfully dropped by a Valiant at Christmas Island in 1957. An RAF team had begun developing nuclear weapons 10 years before, and the service was well trained and equipped to handle these powerful new armaments. The RAF was now made responsible for the British deterrent, for it had immense power to retaliate against any aggressor.
But to be credible, we had to show the world we could scramble fast enough to avoid being wiped out on the ground. The QRA, Quick Reaction Alert, was the highest state of readiness we'd ever known in peacetime.
The NATO early warning radar station at Fylingdales was placed under RAF command. It could give 4 minutes warning of even a missile attack. The V-bomber force, by hard training and superb teamwork, could get airborne in half that time. American Thor missiles were lent to the RAF to strengthen the Western deterrent threat. Meanwhile, blue steel was developed. This British guided weapon, launched from a V-bomber, could fly for 100 miles. Then Britain was promised the American Skybolt with a range of 1,000 miles. Just as the RAF was ready to carry it, Skybolt was abruptly cancelled by the United States. Instead, Britain was offered Polaris. So, after 12 years, the deterrent passed to the Royal Navy. The V-bomber force had been so costly that other RAF roles had to be cut back savagely. But the performance of men and machines was higher than ever. The RAF got its first supersonic fighter. The Lightning had radar guidance and air-to-air missiles for interception. The first squadrons of Bloodhound surface-to-air missiles were formed, but the government of the day ordained
Fighter Command now has the limited task of defending the bomber bases, and its strength is being reduced.
worse was to come. A serious economic crisis cancelled the next generation of RAF aircraft. The TSR-2, replacement for the aging Canberra, had already flown and showed great promise, but it was scrapped. The HS-681 short takeoff transport was never built, nor was the P-1154 vertical takeoff fighter. But vertical takeoff, pioneered in Britain, was allowed to develop into the invaluable Harrier. Since the war, Royal Air Force bases all over the world had closed as Britain withdrew from her imperial past. But the winds of change were blowing, and despite the closures of these bases, the RAF became involved in many limited wars of national liberation, often communist-inspired. So the service developed a big strategic force of transport aircraft, Beverleys, Britannias, and Comets, to carry fully equipped troops like fire brigades to warlike outbreaks anywhere on Earth. The RAF was involved in many operations overseas. Kenya, to quell the Mau Mau terrorists. Cyprus, to counter Ioka nationalists. Suez, to support Anglo-French intervention in the Egyptian-Israeli war. Kuwait, to deter a takeover bid by Iraq. South Arabia, to help suppress the Radfan revolt. Malaysia, to resist Indonesian pressure on Borneo. In such trouble spots, our ground forces relied heavily on helicopters. Short-range transports, such as the Twin Pioneer, were also widely used in the wild country. Our troops were backed up by traditional types like the faithful Hastings, and they had the tactical support of more aggressive aircraft when a little violence was needed. By the 1960s, The mass movement of troops and equipment at short notice had become so frequent that larger, faster aircraft, DC-10s, Belfasts, Hercules, came into service. The worldwide communications network had to be greatly expanded by Signals Command to cope with the many emergency operations and the complex traffic of a huge military airline. Air transport had become the leading role in the R.A.F., tending to unbalance a fighting service. Again, defense spending was cut back, and many more overseas bases were evacuated. Aden, the largest British base in the Middle East. Bahrain, where we kept the peace in the oil-rich Arabian Gulf. Gan, a speck in the Indian Ocean, but a vital staging post on our route to the Far East. Singapore, the greatest of all our overseas bases. The wings of the R.A.F. still remained. In Hong Kong, our only surviving foothold in the Far East. In Cyprus, so long a base for operations in the Near East. In Gibraltar, guarding the western approaches to the Mediterranean. So the need for the mighty air transport fleet had largely declined. Now the R.A.F. had to build up its combat strength again to support NATO in 3 command areas: Europe, Channel, which included the UK air defences, and the Atlantic. Britain was unique in the alliance in committing her air force to defend all 3 areas. In peacetime, NATO could only directly command forces which had been formally declared to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, such as the air defense fighters and the surface-to-air missile squadrons. Radar was still our first line of defense, with ground stations watching for missiles and high-flying aircraft, while the airborne early warning radars flying in Shackletons, descendants of the Lancaster, guarded against low-level attacks. When, as too often now happens, the NATO control and reporting system found intruders in British airspace, our fighters had to react promptly. These Phantom crews, like their forebears in Camels and SE-5s, Spitfires and Hurricanes, had to intercept the intruder, identify it, shadow it, or shepherd it out of our airspace. If need be, they could destroy it. Success depended on the reliability of the weapons and, as it always has done and always will, on the instant readiness of the aircraft to attack any day or night, including Christmas. In the 1970s, our strategic bomber force was assigned to NATO for use in war, but Britain kept control of her nuclear weapons. Later, the Vulcans were modified for low-level strike and reconnaissance. They were backed up by the Buccaneers, also with a nuclear capability. Maritime patrolling was taken over by the Nimrods, carrying highly trained specialized crews to operate anti-submarine sensors and weapons. The Nimrod's main task was to keep track of Russia's fast-growing fleet of nuclear submarines and other potentially hostile vessels, and to guard the sea and air routes on which our island life depends. Air refueling had fulfilled the hopes of its pioneers. The R.A.F. tanker force of Victors, equipped to refuel a variety of aircraft far from base, had greatly increased the range and weapon load of all our combat aircraft. Air refueling had also made it easier and faster to deploy our aircraft to distant parts of the world. In Europe, where NATO faced the strongest opposition, the R.A.F. operated Jaguars, Phantoms, Harriers, Buccaneers, Puma and Wessex helicopters. The machinery was growing more complex, more professional, but the roles of the squadrons had been shaped by history. The versatile Phantom could be used for air combat, strike, ground attack, and reconnaissance, but it required long, strong runways. The single-seat Jaguar could operate from simple airstrips, even motorways, and was comparatively easy to service. Although smaller than the Phantom, it could deliver a heavier punch more accurately and to more distant targets. The amazing Harrier was able to operate from any flat surface the size of a tennis court, and the word airfield had regained its old meaning. The Harrier could easily be hidden and maintained and serviced in the hide. It could stay close to the shifting battle, like the fighters in the First World War, but it hit 1,000 times harder. Combat aircraft also cost 1,000 times more than their ancestors, so RAF training was becoming more important each year. Fixed-wing pilots began on Bulldogs and finished on the all-purpose Hawk, which could introduce them to any operational role. Chopper pilots began to specialize in Whirlwinds before completing their training in Gazelles and Pumas. Navigators learnt their trade in Dominers. Since Trenchard's time, the foundations of the RAF, flying and engineering, had not changed in excellence, but they'd widened beyond even his vision. Now, supporting every aircraft was a great team of specialists, each trained to wring every bit of reliability and readiness from the machinery in his expert hands. Supporting this forward line were many backs. This huge team of professionals were now needed for the defense of Britain. For aircraft and weapons unserviceable, and crews hungry or unhealthy can defend no interests and win no wars. As their tasks grew more complex, each of the team had to see his or her role not merely as a job, but as a vital part of the whole purpose of the Royal Air Force, to keep British air power secure. In her Silver Jubilee year, Queen Elizabeth II again reviewed her Air Force. When the Royal Flying Corps was formed, its ambition was to be as clever as the Royal Engineers and as smart as the Guards. 65 years later, on parade and in the air, the Royal Air Force was proud to prove this to the Sovereign. History is bunk, Henry Ford is said to have said, but past and future are close relatives. For the future, the RAF has put its faith in the Tornado, a single design which can fill many historic roles. Behind this achievement lies the distilled experience of the past, of Blériot, Mitchell, Messerschmitt, Whittle, and thousands of others who have created and operated aircraft. The Royal Air Force has played a purposeful part in the story. It is worth remembering, as Guy Gibson VC wrote after the Dam Busters raid. If people forget, they bring war on themselves. After many years, they will ask for disarmament so they can raise their standard of living. Movies and radio should remind this and future generations of what happened, to keep this danger in everyone's mind so that we can never be caught on the wrong foot again, so that our children will have a chance to live. History has taught us, time and again, that air power is vital to our survival. Or, as Churchill put it, we must be masters of our own air.